So Wendy, thank you for your introduction. As Wendy said, it is a privilege for me to be a GP in Wheatley. And it was conversations that I've had in the course of my work as a GP that sort of gave rise to the title of this talk. It has been an unusual year. I think unprecedented, has seen unprecedented quantities of use in the last year. And it's been a really difficult one for people in different ways. I guess one of the unusual things that happened in about March last year was that death became part of the daily headlines. The topic that has traditionally been quite taboo, or at least not something that we've readily talked about in our culture, suddenly became sharply in focus for all of us. And so it was perhaps not surprising that I would have a number of consultations with people struggling with health anxiety. There was a fortnight last year when I had two particular consultations with physically healthy people who were experiencing terrible health anxiety which bound them into patterns of constant symptom checking, Google searching, reassurance seeking. Life for them had really become a misery because, and they both used these words, they were terrified of dying. Now, ideally, when I have a consultation and the patient and I have discussed what the nature of their problem is and we've worked out, where that is, I'll then be able to suggest to the patient a plan of action or a remedy, something to address the problem. But with this consultation, what solution could I give to someone terrified of dying? What could I say or offer to these patients that would release them from that fear, the imprisoning fear of death for them? Is there any way of avoiding death? Is there any comfort in the face of it? It's not unusual, actually, for consultations to raise questions I can't answer there and then. There's professional development terminology for that situation. The unresolved issues are called patient unmet needs, and of course that abbreviates to the acronym PUNS, and then that may then translate into a doctor's educational need, or a DEN. And if a pun arises from a DEN, it's helpful sometimes for the doctor to spend some time reflecting on the consultation. What didn't I know that would have helped me meet that patient's needs, and to address that through some extra learning. So in this consultation, we got as far as working out that the anxious feelings and the behaviours were driven by this fear of death. That was the patient's unmet need to be freed from the fear of death that I hadn't quite met. So I did some extra reading about managing anxiety, and I reminded myself about the cognitive behavioural therapy strategies that I know can be really useful and effective in anxiety. Cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, requires the patient to identify unhelpful thought patterns, what's called the cognitive distortions that can lead to anxious thoughts and behaviours. And certainly health anxiety is quite often typified by a thought or cognitive distortion called catastrophizing. I find it really hard to say, catastrophizing, which is where you jump to the worst case scenario assumption, even when it's quite unlikely. But here we are in the middle of a global pandemic. The past year has really been a catastrophe, at least at a national level, for some of us personally. It's something of a worst case scenario. And my other thought was, well, to some degree, a fear of death is a normal thing. It's almost quite a healthy thing. It's what stops us from doing dangerous things. Maybe it's even what, at least for the sake of others, even if not for our own concerns, keeps us sticking to these rules of social distancing that are so tricky to keep on with. But when we start to feel very aware of our own mortality, and I think we probably all have felt more in touch with that idea lately, death can become more terrifying. Death means loss. It might mean loss of potential in the young, loss of relationship, loss of control. And there's uncertainty there, isn't there, about how and when we might die, and also perhaps about what comes after death. Now, I'm obviously speaking to you today at a church event as a Christian, as someone who's quite convinced that my faith does give hope in the face of death. Yet I might be unnerved by these words from Hebrews, a book in the New Testament, which speaks about death. Man is destined to die once, and after that, face judgment. I'm right to be unnerved. In my own strength and my own standing, I have no desire to face God's judgment. But the next two words in that verse name the person we need to know, who stands with us, actually stands in our place in the worst that death can bring us. Let me introduce Jesus to you by reading the shortest verse in the Bible. It's from the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. John's describing here Jesus' response to the death of a friend he loved and to seeing the grief of his friends at that death. Death was not part of God's plan for his perfect creation, and it grieves him. To give a bit more background, let's go back to the start of John chapter 11. Jesus learns that his friend Lazarus is ill. He's several days' journey from their home when Lazarus' sisters send a message to him to tell him Lazarus is ill. This isn't the WhatsApp age, is not even the Royal Mail age. We can suppose they were quite concerned about the seriousness of their brother's condition to send that message. The message they send doesn't explicitly ask Jesus to come, doesn't ask Jesus to heal Lazarus, but there's a suggestion in the narrative that they have faith in Jesus, that he can change the course of this illness. And yet, on hearing this serious news, Jesus tells his disciples who are with him, this illness will not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And he stays put 2 more days. 2 days later, he says to his disciples, Lazarus has died, but let us go to him. And he arrives finally at Lazarus' home 4 days after his death and burial. Jesus is not taken by surprise by that, but his compassion and grief at the human suffering is really clear in the passage. John is quite a poetic writer, and he uses repetition to really emphasize what he wants to get across. And he tells us twice Jesus is deeply moved. Jesus knows grief. And yet in his grief and with authority, he calls for the tombstone to be removed. And calling on the name of God, his Father, Jesus shouts out into the tomb, Lazarus, come out. There are no healing spells, no CPR, just a command. And still wrapped in the burial wraps, Lazarus comes out alive. Perhaps if you're familiar with that story, it's easy to lose the absolute awe and astonishment of that moment. Perhaps if you're not familiar with the Bible, it sounds more like a legend than a history. I wanted to share that passage this morning, that account, because for me, it shows me 2 things about Jesus that really helped me in the face of death. It shows us his compassion and his grief at the hurt that death causes. Jesus didn't wander around Judea as some aloof spiritual teacher. He cared for individuals, for this family. He loves them and he grieves with them. And when I'm grieved by death, my friend and Lord Jesus is too. The second thing that this story of Lazarus shows us is that Jesus has authority over death. This miracle foreshadows the act we read of later in John that actually releases us from fear of death, Jesus' own death and his resurrection that follows. And for Jesus, death was truly a fearful experience, not just for the awful physical torture of the crucifixion, but for the deeper spiritual pain of being separated from his heavenly Father. The Gospels talk of Jesus in the garden prior to the crucifixion, the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating and praying fervently for the cup to be taken from him. He means the cup of God's judgment, God's righteous anger and judgment on sinful mankind. That's judgment I deserve, but that he has taken for me and I no longer face. And faced with death, Jesus asks only that I believe. He uses those words to Martha in the Lazarus account as well. And with belief comes hope, because Jesus rose from the dead, conquered death, and offers me hope of salvation and relationship, friendship with him. Going back to my reading about treating anxiety, I revisited as well an approach that I came across when I was working as a junior doctor in psychiatry, in a therapy called solution-focused therapy. The therapist asked the patient to consider an answer to what's termed the miracle question. And this is the wording of the miracle question. Suppose that while you're sleeping tonight and the entire house is quiet, a miracle happens. The miracle is that the problem which brought you here is solved. However, because you're sleeping, you don't know the miracle has happened. So when you wake up tomorrow morning, what will be different that will tell you that a miracle has happened and that the problem which brought you here is solved? And it's a useful question, because often when patients have been entrenched in patterns of anxiety and the behaviours that follow on from that, it's very hard for them to envisage or live a life without that anxiety that's become so much part of their existence. And so they have to think through, what does life look like without this problem here? Now, the joy of being a Christian is that in each morning, I have anew the assurance that when I wake up, the miracle of being redeemed from fear of death has already happened. And when I wake up each morning, whatever lies before me in the way of work or worldly trouble, Jesus is there with me. And beyond it, whenever this earthly life ends, I have a hope of heaven. And that gives more than comfort, although that's a huge assurance. It gives purpose in living. It gives me a purpose to live with and for Jesus. And I think in this pandemic, in the lockdown particularly, purpose and hope are what help us to live well whilst all this death around us is reported and is going on. So you might ask yourself the miracle question this morning, but be assured the miracle has already happened. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you. I think Caroline is picking up now.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. That's just so much food for thought from there. Excuse me. And we've got some time now for a question and answer. So what I'm going to say is that if people can use the chat function and chat the questions through to me, that way, if you want an anonymous question, then I'm the only person who will see who it's come from. And so I'm going to give you a minute or two, and you can obviously keep thinking as other questions have come in. I've got one so far, but just it could be a question that you yourself have, or it could be something provoked by discussion with a friend. And Naomi is going to do her best to approach these questions. So I'll keep the chat function open for a minute. You can have your brains whirring. And I can start, in fact, with one that I've already been chatted through, which is, how do you feel if people talk to you about the fear of death when they're not even ill? So that's an interesting one.
It's actually, it has come up a lot this year, and I think particularly for these patients with health anxiety, that is a problem as much as any physical illness. For a lot of patients, it's significantly impacting their quality of life, their experience of life. So, particularly in those instances, it was really helpful, because I think that was probably the first time they'd verbalized that being the root cause of a lot of their problems. I think as a society, we do tend to brush death under the carpet. We don't like to confront it until we're forced into it. Doing a bit of reading in preparation for this talk, that a lot of writers reflect on the fact that probably a century ago, when infant mortality was so much higher, when I guess a lot more of us were in the habit of going to church, when we were in more extended families, so you'd be living with older generations closer by, that the fact of death was just much more a fact of life, of everyday life. It was there. And I think that, we live in such a sanitized and such a healthy society now, that where health is a right, that it's really difficult for us to just engage with this idea of death being, a present thing for us at whatever stage of life we're at, in a healthy way. So yeah, I feel compassion for people, because it is awful to be bound by anxiety about anything. But particularly at the moment, rationalizing, well, where is my fear of death a normal thing, and where does it become unhealthy, is a tricky one to untangle.
Yeah, no, it is. Thank you. Okay, next question. So is the fear of death and the fear of dying, are they two different things, or are they one and the same?
They're totally two different things. I think, although probably there's a Venn diagram, isn't there? And the degree of overlap it depends on what stage of life you're at and where you are. So I think fear of death is probably more of a spiritual type question. Fear of dying, I think, is around, so the process, and, probably fear of things like symptoms, pain, loneliness and isolation. Those are the things that come out when I talk to patients when they're talking about actually dying. Those are the concerns they have. And I think, speaking as a Christian, there are Christians who will be fearful about the process of dying, and Christians who've written books about that, and saying actually how very difficult it is. And that's not because they're not sufficiently spiritual or faithful. It's that, dying is an adventure. There was a Christian GP dying from terminal cancer in his late 30s, and he wrote a diary of his experiences and called it "Dying, the Greatest Adventure of My Life." It is a journey into the unknown, isn't it? And I think it's normal to have some anxiety or fear in that situation.
Yes, gosh, that sounds like an interesting read, that one.
Yeah, it's a short pamphlet. And
really? Okay, just read. Please do feel free to keep the questions coming. I've got a couple more lined up, but there's definitely time for a few more after that. So what can you actually say to your say about faith to parents? Well, number one, in such a short consultation, but number two, I guess, within the bounds of what you're allowed to as a GP as well.
Yeah. So the GMC does provide very clear guidance about doctors should allow their faith to impact or not impact their work. So I think the first thing is that I need to be really clear that I'm offering good medical care, and that any mention of my faith is in that context, and not derailing good and standard medical care. So I certainly can mention faith, and there are times when it's really appropriate and really helpful. An obvious situation would be when I'm consulting with people who I know are Christians. I think for me, being a Christian GP and having an awareness of faith being so important to me, is that it does make it much easier just to raise the question of faith and how that's impacting a patient's experience of their illness. So I will sometimes ask patients, do you have a faith that helps you or affects how you feel about this particular thing that's going on for you? And that can be helpful for patients perhaps to explore things that that they've not thought about for a while, that can be really helpful to them in a situation. Sometimes it unearths some traumatic memories, unhelpful memories of past experiences in church or from other faiths, which are clearly having a negative impact on them. In 10 minutes, well, patients who've ever consulted with me will know I'm not great at sticking to time. Yeah, in 10 minutes it's difficult. But again, the privilege of general practice is that I don't get just 10 minutes with my patients. I may only get 10 minutes on any one day, but that is a relationship that builds over months and years, and I will see them, recurrently over time. And sometimes those conversations don't happen on the first 20 consultations, but the relationship is there, and then sometimes it becomes really appropriate, or we've developed enough of an understanding of where one another's at to have those conversations.
That's really helpful, thank you. If I'm a Christian and I'm afraid of dying, does that mean that my faith isn't strong enough? That's a good one from someone.
Yeah, so totally not. I think particularly for those, so there's being afraid of dying sort of in the abstract, isn't there? As in, you, as far as you're aware, you're not imminently at risk of dying, barring accidents. And then there's facing dying when you've got a diagnosis that means that your life expectancy is significantly shortened. And as we sort of said in answer to the earlier questions, so talking about fear of death and fear of dying, I think you can be absolutely assured of your being heaven bound, but still find the prospect of sort of how you're going to get there fearful. So I don't think it means that there's a lack of faith there. I think sometimes that's God's way of calling you to greater dependence on him, perhaps. I think it was C.S. Lewis, wasn't it, who wrote sometimes that suffering is God's megaphone, perhaps when we're not hearing his other ways of talking to us. He encourages us to bring our cares and anxieties before him, and day by day he will provide what we need.
Thank you. I love that quote from C.S. Lewis. He has quite a few wonderful ones. Okay, next. Are there things we can do, or ways that we can help ourselves prepare for dying so that we aren't afraid? I guess, in every situation, I guess, particularly if we know that we're ill. Yeah.
So I think this applies for everybody, whether you're a Christian or not, that the more we don't engage with the thought about our immortality and put it off, the harder it becomes to engage with that, and the more fearful of it we will become. It's like the sort of existential version of a massive essay crisis, isn't it? I think, not denying it as a reality, but engaging with it. I think if you don't have faith, you really do need to wrestle with the idea of what happens after death, and if there is this offer there of an amazing redemption that I may be in need of, I don't quite know about that yet, then investigate that. Don't put it off. If you're confident in your faith, I think, again, I would say be prepared to talk about matters of death. I've got friends my age who have files on their laptop detailing who they would like to be informed of their death when it happens, their funeral service order, and which hymns they want sung, and which versions of which hymns, so that if they die before their parents die, it won't cause offence. And that's perhaps a very sort of pragmatic and trying to take control of the things we can't control sort of response to death. But I think sometimes actually being practical about things really does help us in our fears and uncertainties, doesn't it? That there are things on a faith front, certainly, that we can do this side of heaven. There are practical things that we can do before death's even something, in a sense, that's on our horizons, that I think can be helpful. And I wonder are there any particular resources that you would recommend? I know that some books look at it, and I don't know, I've read some interesting books that looked at kind of
dying and palliative care. It sounds like a
Mm.
morbid thing to ask, but actually sometimes it's quite interesting reading.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on what sort of things you like to read. A book I found, so if you're like a fiction reader and you want something that's just going to provoke a bit more thought about this, and you want to be able to tell people you've read Tolstoy and you never have before, he wrote a book called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. I think I've pronounced that correctly. It's really short, so I'm really pleased I can say I've read Tolstoy, and it's only like 10 chapters. Tim's wading through War and Peace, and I'm never going to do it, but that one's good. And it's in a sense quite a harrowing fiction book, but with a beautiful ending about a Russian. I think he's a judge, and he's dying and dying in a state really of mental and spiritual anguish, aside from his physical symptoms. And well, I can't do a spoiler, but anyway, he goes these last few days of his life. He goes on a journey from ruining the kind of the superficiality and unsatisfactory nature of his life so far, to 2 hours from his death, suddenly, as it were, seeing the light. And that I found it a very uplifting book to read, actually, when I finished it. So that's if you like fiction that sort of prompts thoughts and meditation, that's quite a good one. As you say, there's any number of titles out there around the idea or subjects of death and suffering. I think Dying, the Greatest Adventure of My Life, it's by, I think the surname is Casson. So it's a £2 booklet that some Christian bookshops sell. Certainly Keith Jones booksellers sell it, and we'll post that out to you. So that's quite a sort of short pamphlet, and it's a very honest diary from this GP who's dying, and really, I think, explores well that sort of issue of, you can be approaching death with absolute faith and assurance, but dying of a terminal illness can really be quite a trial for you and for the family, and how that impacts relationships and things like that. So again, sort of thinking about short reads, those are good. C.S. Lewis has written on the subject of grief and suffering, and so his books again can be helpful. And good, I'd gotten this written down and I can't remember where I put my bit of paper. There is a writer who's written If I Were God, I'd End All the Pain. Can't remember his name. John. I'll have to come up with a list and get Jane to email it out. Yeah, it's again exploring really the concept of suffering and grief within the Christian faith.
Thank you, that's so useful. I walked with a dear friend who passed away sadly about a year ago from cancer, and actually I was, she kind of looked it straight in the face and definitely read some books in the last few months of her life that were kind of very much looking at it head on, which I deeply admired. There's a few more. So isn't Christianity just a crutch for those who can't manage on their own? Honest question there.
Yeah, I was reflecting on this question this morning, actually, because I was reading in Isaiah, and the picture that the writer of Isaiah paints of God is just so huge and so enormous. Our creator God is such an awesome God. It is hard to comprehend him as a human. And so I think, we can have two responses to that, can't we? We can say, that's too big, so it can't be. I'll live life in the way that I can understand it in my own view. Or we can say, isn't it just amazing that this awesome, huge creator God, who hasn't just made me and this bit of Oxfordshire, he's made the world and the stars and all that is in it, and yet intimately, reaches down, not just to reveal himself in the prophetic words in Isaiah, but reaches down to reveal himself in the person of Jesus. Isn't that amazing? And he's caused it all to be written down in the Bible so that I can read it. And he's moved my heart so that I can respond to it and worship him. I didn't become a Christian until I was 21. I did grow up with the idea of Christianity. I grew up going to church. I just didn't understand the gospel. I didn't understand the message of the cross, really, what Jesus had done for me, that this wasn't about me trying to follow a set of rules or live a life that sort of met certain standards. This is about me living in relationship with Jesus and in obedience to him. I just think, how does that change come about in someone if it's not by a greater being than we can imagine affecting us?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and another interesting one here: is our fear of death an indication of some sort of spiritual insight? If there's nothing afterwards, then surely there's no problem. That's a really, really thoughtful one there.
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? Yeah. Yes, I guess that's a really, really good point. If there was nothing after us, wouldn't we just all live fast and for the best we possibly could, and not worry about the consequences?
Yeah. Have you seen people react to death in ways that have really struck you, either particularly good or particularly bad over the years?
Yes. There's one patient who always will stay with me, actually, for the awfulness of watching her die, and perhaps that's where the book, the Death of Ivan Illich, I spoke about, really struck me. She was admitted to the hospice where I was working. She wasn't very young, but she wasn't very old. I think she was in her mid-60s, and she was angry. She was angry about being terminally ill, and she was angry about dying, and her death was a battle. And it was so hard to palliate her symptoms, I think, because of her anger. That's really stuck with me. I think, to counter that, actually, I'll tell you about a patient my husband was caring for on the COVID wards last week. They're scary places, the COVID HDU. These are patients who are struggling with their breathing. And, by the time they're on high dependency unit, you know that you're in the worst group when it comes to survival. So all of these patients are very much looking death in the face. And there was one patient on the ward, an Indian gentleman who is a Christian, and whenever he had breath, he was singing hymns, and he was always smiling. His lack of fear in the face of death, and last I heard, he's not died, but he's fully aware that's a possibility. But he was joyful in the face of a situation where many others were fearful. And Tim said his presence on the ward, it lightened it. For nurses and doctors going in there, he was a unique experience caring for him because of his joy in his faith.
Wow, that's something I hope that I'd want to hope for myself as well over the years. So almost at the end of our questions list, but sorry, just looking down them. Are there actually places or things that you can recommend for people who have health anxiety, and I guess maybe anxiety, death anxiety as well? Just any practical resources you could recommend or places they should go?
Yes, and again, I think actually it might be quite useful if we do send out some links, because it's quite difficult to give a reliable link verbally. The Northwest are great actually at producing online resources. The Northwest Health Region and Northwest Training produce a variety of mental health resources and leaflets that I think are really excellent and give some really valuable sort of exercises and things that you can do, you know, on your own whilst awaiting, or, you know, prior to seeking, you know, sort of face-to-face or telephone as it is at the moment, professional help. They do produce one that's specifically around anxiety, not specifically around health anxiety, but around anxiety. And there's it talks you through some of the sort of cognitive behavioural type exercises that you can do there. And there are resources online for doing cognitive behavioural therapy, self-help. So for people with, you know, quite high levels of anxiety, that's possibly not going to be manageable, but resources like Mood Gym, you can work through a number of exercises there, and those can be a good place to start.
That's really helpful, thank you. Yeah, I think it would be great as a, you know, in the follow-up that there was a list of resources, and perhaps I should say, if one of you has read a book or an article or listened to a talk or whatever, or a podcast that you felt actually, you know, that really speaks to this, then maybe ping Jane an email, or the women's events at Sweetly. If you ping an email back and perhaps we collate things or send one of us a message, then that, or even feel free to pop it in the chat now and I'll just collate them and just send them through to Jane. Then it would be useful for some shared wisdom. I've certainly read one or two things over the years that I thought, you know, have really sewn into that. I think that brings us to the end of our question list. So I'm going to hand over to Jane, who's going to wrap us up. Thank you so much, Naomi. It's hard to think on your feet. Kind of giving you a silent clap, all of us, as we're all getting used to on Zoom now. But actually, yeah, that's some really insightful answers to some quite meaty questions. Jane, over to you to wrap us up.